In January 2019, WeWork was valued at $47 billion. That was the official valuation, agreed upon by SoftBank, the Japanese conglomerate that had invested $10 billion in the company and had just committed to investing $2 billion more. By September of the same year, WeWork had withdrawn its IPO, its founder had been removed as CEO, its valuation had been revised to somewhere between $10 and $15 billion, and the company was facing a cash runway of approximately 2 weeks before it ran out of money entirely. SoftBank organized a rescue package. It cost $9.5 billion. In exchange, they received a controlling stake in a company they had, 10 months earlier, valued at $47 billion. That's a $37 billion swing in market perception in under a year. For context, that's larger than the entire market capitalization of dozens of Fortune 500 companies. It didn't happen because a product failed. It didn't happen because a market collapsed. It happened because an IPO prospectus made the company's financials, governance, and internal practices available to public scrutiny for the first time. And what the scrutiny found was incompatible with the story that had been sustaining the valuation. WeWork's S-1 filing is now studied in business schools as a document that, in its attempt to make the company's story legible to public investors, inadvertently made the company's actual situation legible to anyone willing to read it carefully. The losses were larger than anyone outside the company had known. The governance structure gave the founder a level of control that was, by any conventional standard, unprecedented and unaccountable. The properties were leased long-term and subleased short-term in a structure that created significant exposure if office demand declined. None of this was new information for the people inside the company. The question at the center of WeWork is not what happened in September 2019. The question is how a company got to a $47 billion valuation when the information that would collapse that valuation was sitting in its own financial statements the entire time. And the answer to that question says something uncomfortable about how markets work and about the specific conditions under which very smart, very motivated people choose not to look at things that are in plain sight. Adam Neumann is easy to caricature in retrospect. The tequila on planes, the private jet, the claim that WeWork's mission was to elevate the world's consciousness, the conflict of interest arrangements that had him leasing buildings he personally owned back to the company he ran. In the standard telling, these details are evidence of a fraud or a mania that sophisticated investors should have caught. The more accurate version is more complicated. The investors who backed WeWork through multiple funding rounds were not naive. SoftBank's Masayoshi Son is one of the most experienced technology investors in history. Benchmark Capital, which backed WeWork's early rounds, has a portfolio that includes Uber, Twitter, and Snapchat. JP Morgan, which was managing the IPO, employs analysts whose specific job is to assess business models. They all knew the losses were real. They knew the lease structure created exposure. They had access to the governance documents that gave Neumann disproportionate voting control. The information was in the financial statements. The financial statements were shared with every major investor before each funding round. What happened was not ignorance. What happened was a specific kind of motivated reasoning that venture capital and late-stage private equity are particularly prone to. The belief that a founder's vision and momentum were worth more than the underlying financials, and that the conventional metrics used to evaluate businesses were not applicable to this particular company because this particular company was changing the way the world worked. This reasoning has a name in investment circles. It's called narrative override. The moment when the story a company tells about itself becomes more persuasive than the numbers, and when the investors most committed to the story become the last people capable of evaluating it clearly. Have you ever been inside a story that was more compelling than the evidence? Somewhere you were too committed to what it meant to look clearly at what it was. Leave a comment. I'm asking seriously, not rhetorically. Narrative override is not irrational. It has produced real returns on real investments. The problem is that it's indistinguishable from inside it from a mistake of the same kind. By early 2019, WeWork was burning through approximately $220 million per month. The company's losses were growing faster than its revenue. The lease obligations, which were real and long-term, were not reflected in any metric that WeWork used publicly to describe its own health. The company had invented its own measurement, community-adjusted EBITDA, which added back not only standard non-cash charges, but also items like rent expense, which is the primary cost of running an office space business. This is the equivalent of a restaurant chain calculating its profitability by adding back food costs. The metric produced numbers that looked healthy. It was measuring something real, the company's performance before its central operating expense, and calling it a proxy for business health. The IPO process forced WeWork to present its financials according to conventional accounting standards. The S-1 showed a net loss of $1.9 billion on revenue of $1.8 billion in 2018. Revenue was growing at approximately 100% year over year, but the losses were growing at roughly the same rate. There was no visible path to profitability on the scale the company was operating at. The market read this and responded immediately. Within days of the S-1 filing, analysts began revising their valuation estimates sharply downward. By the time WeWork withdrew the IPO, the internal consensus on valuation had fallen to somewhere between $10 and $20 billion, a range that implied the previous $47 billion figure had been either wildly wrong or deliberately inflated. If this is the kind of detailed, honest analysis you're here for, no shortcuts, no simplified narrative, just the actual mechanism, then the like button is the direct signal. More of this gets made based on that signal. What's significant is that none of this required special access or investigative skill to see. It required reading the publicly filed document and applying standard financial analysis to it. The question that should bother anyone watching the private markets is not, how did WeWork's IPO fail? The question is, why did $47 billion of committed capital not do this analysis before the company went public? The people who lost most visibly in WeWork's collapse were not the institutional investors. SoftBank lost billions, but SoftBank's total fund was $100 billion. The loss was painful. It was not existential. Masayoshi Son called the WeWork investment his foolish mistake in a shareholders' meeting and moved on. The people for whom the collapse was existential were the roughly 12,500 employees who had been granted stock options as part of their compensation. These were not executives. They were engineers, designers, operations staff, community managers, people who had taken jobs at a company that was, by every public signal available to them, one of the most valuable private companies in the world. They had often accepted compensation packages that traded cash salary for equity. They were told the equity would be worth significant money when the company went public. When the IPO was withdrawn and then restructured under SoftBank's terms, the employee stock options were restructured in ways that reduced or eliminated their value for many of the people who held them. The restructuring that saved the company was not designed to protect employee equity. It was designed to protect SoftBank's preferred position in Neumann's exit package, which controversially included a $1.7 billion payout arranged as part of the rescue deal. Neumann left with $1.7 billion. The community managers who had believed the story they were told about their equity left with options that were worth significantly less than they had been promised, or nothing at all. I'm not making a legal argument here. The legal structure of WeWork's equity arrangements was disclosed in the documents that almost nobody read. The ethical structure of those arrangements is a different question, one that I find considerably harder to set aside than the financial one. The people who built the physical presence of WeWork, who staffed the desks and managed the members and made the spaces function, had no access to the information that would have changed their decision to take those compensation packages. The information asymmetry was not accidental, it was structural. That distinction matters. WeWork still exists. It filed for bankruptcy in 2023, restructured, and continues to operate a much smaller network of co-working spaces. The core business model, leasing office space and subleasing it on flexible terms, was never itself the problem. It was the valuation placed on that business and the story constructed around it that collapsed. The actual lesson here is not about Adam Neumann's character or SoftBank's judgment. Those are the easy versions. The actual lesson is about the conditions under which narrative becomes a substitute for analysis. And those conditions are not unique to WeWork. They're present in any market where a compelling story, growing fast, attracts enough momentum that the people best positioned to evaluate it become the people least motivated to do so because they're already inside it. Every investor who participated in WeWork's later funding rounds had a financial incentive for the company to continue growing and to reach a successful IPO. Questioning the valuation at the point where billions had already been committed and public statements had already been made would have been an act of institutional self-contradiction. The analysis that would have been useful happened before the commitment. By the time it would have mattered most, the people capable of it were already inside the story. The practical thing: whenever you're evaluating something that a lot of smart, motivated people have already committed to, the question worth asking is not whether the story is compelling. It clearly is. That's why the smart people are already in it. The question is what specific measurable outcome would prove the story wrong, and whether anyone is currently tracking that outcome. If the answer is no, if the story is growing but the specific test of the story hasn't been defined, that's the flag. Not because the story is false, because an untested story is indistinguishable from one that is. The next episode looks at a case where a story that looked exactly like this, fast growth, compelling narrative, metrics that obscured the underlying structure, turned out to be real, which raises its own uncomfortable question about what you actually learn from any single case. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.